All right, hello. We're back for part 2 of my series, going over some significant chapters from Kurt Goldstein's book, The Organism. So the part 1 video I put out last time was reviewing chapter 6 on the conception of the organism as a whole. Today we're going to talk about chapter 7, which is certain essential characteristics of the organism in light of the holistic approach. And a lot of today's chapter is going to be about anxiety, and he talks a little bit about the significance of anxiety and some other terms like shock, and I'll talk a little bit about how he defines anxiety and defines these words because I think that's important. He defines it in a I think pretty extreme way. It's not necessarily just the way that we talk about anxiety today. But he's getting a bit existential in this chapter, I would say, and it's an important chapter. So it's going to talk a lot about anxiety, but towards the end, it'll also tie it into some other things as well that are important to know moving forward, to know just about this book. I'd say it's an important chapter. So even if it feels like he's talking about anxiety and fear, and these are things you might already kind of know about, I encourage you to stick around to the end because it is an important chapter. But I'm excited to do some videos, the next 2 videos about chapter 8, and then the latter video will be about chapters 9 and 11. So we're kind of progressively getting more into kind of the philosophical side of Kurt Goldstein. It's not just about Gestalt stuff, not just about his areas of overlap and criticism of Gestalt psychology. There's a lot of just great philosophical topics to this, and it applies to existentialism as well as kind of person-centered considerations of the human person. And I'm looking forward to the last video, part 4, which I think we're going to get really philosophical when we talk about chapters 9 and 11. All right, so anxiety. So towards the beginning of the chapter, he says, as manifold as states of anxiety may be with regard to intensity and kind, they all have one common denominator, the experience of danger, of peril for oneself. To be sure, this characterization is not sufficient, because it only describes the subjective experience, which is merely a part of the entire phenomenon. And he kind of says the next part, there are bodily changes as well. So that kind of gives you a bit of understanding as to what he means by that. But I think this is an important quote, not only in understanding what he means by anxiety and how he uses the term, but also just this little tidbit that shows that for him, he believes that a phenomenon is more than just a subjective experience. So I think that's kind of an important little piece of this quote too. Okay, so basically what I would want you to know about this chapter and what he says about anxiety when he uses this word is he uses it in a pretty extreme way. Interestingly, I think it's kind of counterintuitive to me. He uses the word shock for a less extreme kind of form of this, and anxiety is more extreme than shock. So he'll use those words, so that's important to note. I'll go through it. I'll go through more of his words on anxiety, but to me it seems like he's using anxiety in a lot of this chapter in reference to times when a person might be so overwhelmed. Like fear is this contained kind of rational fear of some object. And anxiety, he kind of uses it in this way of describing like a state of sheer panic and paralyzed kind of overwhelm. So he does talk about this. He says, how does anxiety differ from fear? Anxiety does not arise every time oneself is endangered. Pain may endanger us, but not necessarily bring anxiety with it. Pain is not even necessarily accompanied always by a negative affective state or tone. It may in fact be found along with a certain feeling of pleasure. Anxiety, on the other hand, is always negatively accentuated. It's always experienced as a negative thing. He says, in the state of fear, we have an object in front of us that we can meet, that we can attempt to remove, or from which we can flee. Even if we're not able to kind of overcome it, we have this clear sense of fear of a certain object, and we can kind of contain what it is. We know what it is. And so I'll continue with this quote here. On the other hand, anxiety attacks us from the rear, so to speak. The only thing we can do is to attempt to flee from it without knowing where to go, because we experience it as coming from no particular place. It's more of a state than it is a sense of like there's this contained, clear kind of enemy or threat. He says, in fear, there is an appropriate defense reaction, a bodily expression of tension and of extreme attention to a certain part of the environment. In anxiety, on the other hand, we find meaningless frenzy, with rigid or distorted expression accompanied by withdrawal from the world. In fear, reassurance is possible by explaining that the environmental situation is actually not threatening or that the possibility exists to overcome the danger. But in anxiety, such an assurance is of no avail. So in anxiety, he says, we have more of just this state of overwhelm, and we don't feel like there's an easy way to tackle the source of our overwhelm. And I notice here that he kind of paints a picture in this chapter that that's kind of stigmatizing or kind of like shaming language around people with anxiety, that it's irrational, that it's an inappropriate reaction. So I just want to note that he kind of uses this language like he says on this slide. He says, in fear, it's an appropriate reaction. Fear is appropriate. It's healthy. But he basically says, it kind of comes across a bit as shame on you if you have anxiety, that you're not responding appropriately. And that was just something that came up for me when I read this chapter, a sense that I got from it. But he says more nuanced stuff about anxiety, so I'll get to that as well. Okay, so then he lists some philosophers. He says the philosophers, especially those whose interest was centered around the phenomenon of anxiety, I mention only Pascal, Kierkegaard, and Heidegger, have been very careful to distinguish between anxiety and fear. We may emphasize that Kierkegaard, as well as Heidegger, considers fear as fear of something, while anxiety, in their opinion, deals with nothingness. Their description strongly suggests that anxiety is a state that is without reference to any object. The fact that the catastrophic condition involves the impossibility of ordered reactions precludes a subject having an object in the outer world. So again, he's kind of using this language of like an ordered reaction versus an inordered or disordered reaction. Whereas to me, hearing that, I would maybe think differently about how I would describe anxiety. I think it's fairly inevitable and part of existence. And I think he later kind of says that. So I see different kind of aspects to how he defines anxiety in this chapter. And I think that's kind of interesting. It doesn't seem completely consistent to me, but it's not about my interpretation. I'm really just trying to describe what he's saying to the best of my ability. Okay, he says next, anxiety appears when it has become impossible for an organism to cope in any way with tasks that are commensurate to its real nature. This is the endangering situation. And this is really bringing in his perspective on like self-actualization and the nature of an organism, the nature of a person. He says here, I think it's very important how he says, anxiety is really about an organism not being able to kind of be its true self, to have safety and stability according to its nature. And the next quote here says, the basic phenomenon of anxiety, the occurrence of disordered stimulus evaluation as it is conditioned through the conflict of the organism with a certain environment not adequate for it. This objectively endangers the organism in the actualization of its nature. So anxiety is this kind of like enemy to self-actualization, but he's also gonna, it's more of a threat. He's gonna say in future slides in this video, he's actually gonna say it kind of propels us to self-actualize. It's a motivator. We move in response to kind of fear and anxiety to the threat, but it does threaten to endanger us in our ability to self-actualize. And on this slide, he just has a quote that really reiterates that he is viewing body-mind as truly one thing. An organism is one. So this is just something to note in his own philosophy of body-mind. He says, one usually regards bodily phenomena, the physiological processes of the body, as well as the pattern of expression, only as the sequelae of the mental condition, or at best as concomitant phenomena. As we shall explain later, such a point of view contradicts our concept of body and mind. Sorry, there's a typo there. Mental as well as physical phenomena are for us only different aspects of a unitary life process. And he says this again in the next video I'm going to make. It's a recurring theme in his big theme is organisms are one. Okay, so back to anxiety. I'll read this quote. It is a matter of fact that the normal person in his conquest of the world undergoes over and again states of shock. So he says shock is more normal. It's smaller. It's these small moments of like, oh wow, this is a challenge, or this is a bit scary. I'll continue his quote here. If in spite of this he does not always experience anxiety, this is because his nature enables him to bring forth creatively situations that ensure his existence. So he's able to overcome the small threats of the shock. Thus, the disproportion between his capacity and the demands of the environment, which may lead to catastrophic failure, is averted to a certain degree in average life. As long as the secure state is not essentially shaken and the existence is not endangered, the shocks are not experienced as anxiety. So it has to be that your security, your kind of balance, your homeostasis is not shaken to its very core. There's something more fundamental that is threatened in order to bring about a state of anxiety. He says, only when the world is adequate to man's nature do we find what we call security. He says, shocks are essential to human nature, even to all organic life, and life must, by necessity, take its course via uncertainty and shock. So he's kind of big on life is not perfect, and even though we're constantly striving for homeostasis, for balance, it's not something that really happens in reality. We're never perfectly satisfied. We have to live our lives amid this uncertainty and these fairly regular, kind of constant shocks that we experience from inadequate surroundings. Still, there's something that we can find that feels like relative security, relative stability, even though it's not perfect. So here's where he talks about anxiety as kind of like the springboard for activity of an organism in a way that I think is kind of interesting. So it's kind of the importance of anxiety for self-actualization. He says, where anxiety as the mainspring for the activity of an organism comes into the foreground, we always find that something is upset in the nature of that organism. In other words, an organism is normal and healthy in which the tendency towards self-actualization is acting from within, and overcomes the disturbance arising from the clash with the world, not out of anxiety, but out of the joy of the conquest. Even life in its most perfect manifestation must pass through the disturbances that emerge from the adjustment to the environment. Okay, so he says, in this kind of an existential quote of his, The capacity of bearing anxiety is the manifestation of genuine courage, in which ultimately one is not concerned with the things in the world, but with the threatening of existence. Courage, in its final analysis, is nothing but an affirmative answer to the shocks of existence, which must be borne for the actualization of one's own nature. I think this is a great quote, and it continues here in a minute, but I'll just pause to say I think that's such a great quote that does summarize his kind of existential view of life. He's big on life is not perfect, life is filled with struggle, but there's a difference in being able to kind of creatively adjust and to conquer life's challenges with courage versus kind of the catastrophe of not being able to actualize, to somehow have this huge obstacle put in the way of your self-actualization. That shakes us to our core, to have insecurity, to not have safety to that extent. It basically makes us live in a huge state of anxiety. But to the extent that it's just a human thing, we all have in some way to practice courage, hopefully to be able to overcome threats, but that it's something else to be in such a dismal state in life that you're unable to you're powerless against the threats against you. That is what he says is kind of the ultimate form of anxiety. So I'll just continue with his quote on this last bullet point. This form of overcoming anxiety requires the ability to view a single experience within a larger context. That is, to assume the attitude toward the possible, to have freedom of decision regarding alternatives. Thus, it is a characteristic peculiarity of man. He says this quality of the attitude toward the possible is peculiar, it's specific to humans, to have kind of more freedom. And again, some people have that, but some people don't have as much privilege of freedom and of choice as other people do, who have more privilege. But he says that in general, given the conditions are right, humans are able to take a single experience and hold it within view of a larger context. So he uses the example before of pain. I mentioned this in my last video. We might be able to tolerate pain if we know that it's part of a greater purpose, if there's a larger context. Okay, he's going to start to talk here about ordered behavior and preferred behavior. Preferred behavior is going to be important in the next video. It's an important concept, so that's one of the important things of this chapter. So now he's kind of transitioning from talking about anxiety to how organisms have preferences. They have certain things that they want, that they work towards. And he will I'll read the quotes in later slides and in the next video, but he basically says that this is comparable to the idea of the Gestalt, that wants and needs will arise in our awareness as, oh, that's the next thing I'm after. So he says Gestalt is a word that can be used to kind of describe that. He says a good Gestalt is like a preferred behavior. It's a preference. Okay, so I'll just read this quote. The tendency toward the preferred situation corresponds to the equalization process. That's another important term of his. It is the latter that always brings the organism anew into the situation in which it is capable of the best and most adequate performance. In other words, this tendency is a means to maintain the order of the organism in spite of the influences of interfering stimuli. So he says there's some kind of tendency in organisms to maintain their order, and this is kind of like what the equalization process is. He says we don't ever reach homeostasis truly, perfectly, but this kind of constant thing that we do have is this tendency, which is the equalization process, always striving to get our preferred situation, to maintain our order. And he says, the fact that definite kinds of performances occur in the situational preferred behavior becomes instrumental for determining what the essential attributes or constants of the organism are. And so this is touching on something that I'm sure we'll talk about more in later videos, but Goldstein, one of the things that sets him apart a bit from the Gestalt psychologists in his philosophy is he's comfortable kind of using the word essence or essential. And I'm still a big fan of his. As someone who is very physicalist, I don't tend to have a worldview that really values the concept of soul the way that others use that word. But I think that Goldstein has a very interesting and nuanced view of kind of essence that I feel fairly comfortable with. But it's something I'm still kind of learning about and reaching a greater understanding of his own position on kind of the idea of an essence of a thing. But I think the way he's describing it here is just quite simply, we notice what we might call our constants by the preferred behavior, and that there are definite kinds of like patterns of preferences that we can see in organisms. It might be as a whole species we can see kind of consistent patterns, or it might just be in an individual. He'll talk about that as well in the next chapter. But he uses the word constants, and he says that Gestalt psychology has been helpful for kind of this goal of determining what are some constants in how Gestalts form, or just how does preference kind of arise. So that's a big topic, and I know it's very abstract to kind of talk about that, so I'm doing my best to kind of convey what he's talking about here. But constants, just remember that term. It's going to come up again in the next video as well. Okay, so here we are talking about more about the constants. All right. Constants, ordered behavior and preferred behavior, pertain to the whole organism. He says we are dealing with genuine attributes, or constants, if we find by examining as many fields as possible order and adequate performance in the rest of the organism, rather than rigidity and uniformity as in the reflexes. In this way, we apprehend certain characteristics of the organism with which we are dealing, certain norms and constants of its nature. So he's kind of saying like we can figure out things about human nature based on, okay, across the board in many different situations in as many fields as possible. What do we notice about when the organism experiences kind of like rest and relief and order versus rigidity? He says that's one characteristic to look out for that tells us what are kind of the norms of a being. Next, he says the performances of the organism correspond to these constants. And so he likes this word performance, and he says, I'll not use the word function here. He says the term function may be better reserved for the formal structure of the activity, while performance means concrete action in which the organism actualizes itself. Goethe spoke in this connection of being in actuality. So it's interesting because the term self-actualization was used by others after Goldstein originated it, but something that I don't know always comes across is that, at least in its original definition, Goldstein uses self-actualization in a very like present moment way. It's not this lofty goal that you try to reach by the time you die. It's simply the practice of an organism in its very present moment. It's an activity, it's a performance in a given situation of trying to meet its next step. It's not this goal of like wisdom, becoming a guru. What he's talking about right here is kind of what he means by self-actualization. It's a concrete action. This is the quote: the concrete action in which the organism actualizes itself. So somehow it's this pattern, it's this nature that we see over a pattern that can kind of tell us what are the characteristics, the personality of a thing. But it actually happens moment to moment, situation to situation, in a concrete situation. It is able to actualize itself in that moment. Okay. He says, thus we obtain a number of constants as characteristics of the nature of an organism. So as I mentioned, he says this kind of constant can be seen across a whole species, or it can be a constant of an individual. So in that way, it's kind of like a personality trait or a trait of an individual. Okay, and I just like this quote here in the middle. He says, every human being has a rhythm of his own. A performance is only normal when an individual can accomplish it in the rhythm that is his adequate rhythm for this performance. I just love that quote. He says, it is possible to supplement our knowledge of the constants by regarding a long time sector in the life of an organism. Basically, he says, when we notice that this is a pattern across a longer segment of time, then we can be more sure that we're talking about a constant, a characteristic of the organism. All right, so that about sums it up for this chapter. Our next video is going to continue with some of the themes that we talked about today. We'll be talking about chapter 8 on points of commonality and difference, comparing Goldstein's thoughts to the Gestalt psychologists from whom he kind of comes from, who he worked closely with to form his ideas. He's modifying their framework, but there are a lot of points of commonality, but also important differences, at least differences in focus of what Goldstein wants to focus on compared to them. And Gestalt is very much a big part of kind of my perspective, and so it's a very important topic to my channel, and also will be a very important chapter to understand and to be thinking about when we look to the works of Maurice Merleau-Ponty in a lot of my upcoming videos, which I'm going to start as soon as we conclude this 4-part series on Goldstein. Thank you.